I would like to also welcome to the show Lisa Graves, the Executive Director of the Center for Media and Democracy, which also publishes prwatch.org. Welcome, Lisa. Lisa, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Thank you so much. Could you just briefly tell our listeners who and what the Center for Democracy is and does?
Sure. The Center for Media and Democracy publishes investigative reporting pieces, primarily focused on corporate spin and corporate disinformation campaigns. And so we have a couple of main websites where we publish our original research, and prwatch.org is one of those places. ALEC Exposed, ALEC, EXPOSED.org is another place for one of our major investigative projects, and sourcewatch.org, which is a wiki like Wikipedia, but which really focuses in on corporate disinformation campaigns. And we've recently launched on sourcewatch.org, in connection with The Nation magazine, a project that is about the so-called Fix the Debt operation, the bipartisan campaign that's being touted as the way to solve our nation's debt problem. We've launched a major expose showing the extraordinary conflicts of interest of many of the corporate lobbyists and corporations that are involved in that effort.
So, Lisa, actually, my listeners are very familiar with the Fix the Debt campaign. We have been talking about it since day one. We focus on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and the Fix the Debt Coalition members and their leader, Maya McGinnis, and their funder, Pete Peterson, have been a regular focus of this show. But I want to know what the newest project that you've released with The Nation has revealed in terms of the financial ties that bind Washington.
Oh, sure. Well, and I appreciate that very much. It's heartening for me to know that you all have been out here sounding the alarm about, and quite legitimately sounding the alarm about this Fix the Debt operation. As many of your listeners know, there are a number of groups that have been funded by Pete Peterson, who's a Wall Street billionaire, who managed to get himself basically out of financial risk right before the economy crashed.
Conveniently.
Conveniently before. He's a co-founder of Blackstone, and they were heavily involved in one of the entities that was involved in the housing crisis. He cashed out in 2007 and walked away with about $2 billion from that operation, along with some of his other investments. Didn't sound the alarm on the economy going into the tank right before he cashed out, but now has renewed his efforts to try to kill Social Security. This is a guy who's a former Nixon man. He has pledged to spend $1 billion basically talking about the debt and funding groups to fuel this claim of this debt crisis. And we have new material that we have unveiled, basically, that talks about some of these conflicts. And so we walk through every person who's a leader of Fix the Debt. We show, along with other people's research, but some of our own, how many of these people are actually lobbyists for some of these big corporations that are negative taxpayers, basically. Mm-hmm. People who are not paying their fair share or are profiting a lot. And so a lot of people have heard about Erskine Bowles. He's a former Clinton advisor. He's someone who ran for office in North Carolina, lost. He is one of the two names on the Bowles-Simpson Commission, or the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and he's been peddling a whole bunch of disinformation about debt for a number of years. And he's someone who makes $345,000 a year for a couple of hours of time on Morgan Stanley's board.
Right.
My question to your listeners and to everyone is, do you think that when he's peddling this Fix the Debt operation, he's looking out for your interests or the bank's interests? He gets over $500,000 a year serving on the board of Facebook, which is another company that we recently reported and others have reported, had a major tax loophole that allowed them to escape paying substantial taxes. We document other people who have these conflicts. Maya McGinnis, who you mentioned, who is basically the head of the steering committee related to Fix the Debt, who's worked with on a number of sort of Pete Peterson agenda items. She's someone whose husband is a managing director of Goldman Sachs.
Oh, I didn't know that. This is good news to know. Thank you so much for revealing that.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs is one of the firms that basically played both sides of the market against each other. In one of the major sort of set of deceptive practices, in my view, that contributed to the crash of Wall Street. We've got other folks who are part of Fix the Debt, like Judd Gregg, who's a former senator. On the Fix the Debt website, where they promote these people as spokespeople who are the reasonable people in the room talking about debt, he's also an advisor to Goldman Sachs. He took down $330,000 as an advisor to Goldman Sachs. He's also on the board of Honeywell, which is one of the major defense firms. Got $400,000 for a couple hours of work on Honeywell.
Wow.
When Judd Gregg talks to you about the debt, you hear his name as part of some sort of bipartisan commission. Do you think Judd Gregg is putting the interests of Goldman Sachs and Honeywell before your interests? I bet he is. And we have more and more of that, and all that information is available through a quick website that routes to our SourceWatch site. If you go to Peterson Pyramid, petersonpyramid.org, you can find out about these conflicts of interest. You can tell your neighbors, you can tell your local newspaper, your local editorial board, or the local press when they quote these guys, when they quote Simpson, they quote Bowles, they quote Judd Gregg or Ed Rendell or any of these other folks. You can call them and say, why aren't you reporting how these guys are doing the bidding in their day jobs of some of the biggest contributors to our financial crisis that went down in 2008?
Without revealing the conflict.
Yep.
Actually, you touch on something that I want to further investigate, and that is the fact that, what we're dealing with are these multi-billionaire, multinational corporate actors, so like Pete Peterson, that, have all of this money. They have rigged the Washington game in such a way as to influence the politics so it ultimately benefits their pockets, their bottom line. So, I just wonder about the end game on Peterson's debt focus. So, for example, you can bet against America. If you have enough money to play the international casino, you then can, bet your wages against America with regards to its financial direction and actually win as an individual. And I'm wondering if his incessant focus on the debt, if he actually has a financial stake in terms of driving down America's financial well-being. The second part of that, of course, is we have always known and suspected on Social Security their whole fixation on entitlements, being that if they can actually destabilize the system, then they can force an argument about privatizing the system, and then they'll be there to capture those Social Security dollars on Wall Street. So, what do you think the end game is?
Well, I have to say, we've looked at a lot of corporate-fronted operations or corporate front groups, and I think that Fix the Debt is really an AstroTurf supergroup. It has a targeted budget of $60 million to spend. They say they raised about $40 million. They're one of several voices that basically Pete Peterson either funds directly or indirectly through these sort of shell groups that then fund other groups.
Right.
And, when you take a look at who these guys really are, you see some very interesting things. So, for example, a number of the corporations that are involved in the Fix the Debt operation pay negative tax rates. They have a negative tax rate. A number of them are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars cumulatively on lobbying to prevent the United States from changing its tax code to prevent them from basically offshoring profits to escape paying their fair share into maintaining the American government. And so you have this very deceptive operation in which they want to wrap themselves around the flag or wrap the flag around themselves, and they want to claim that they're good corporate citizens, that that this is a bipartisan effort, and in fact it is a bipartisan effort of these corporate interests. But many of these companies aren't paying their fair share. In fact, they've rigged the tax system to aid their tax avoidance schemes and keep our government from having the money it needs to function. Meanwhile, I think so. You have this issue of the offshoring profits and offshoring jobs, and not fixing these loopholes that give some of the biggest corporations in the world negative tax rates in the U.S. While you and me and most of your listeners, we pay 35% or more of taxes.
Right.
We don't have a bunch of lobbyists who are lobbying for special tax loopholes for us.
So they're parasites. They're parasites on the system, sucking the financial life out of this nation for their own personal benefit.
Well, and they want to claim that they're the patriots. In fact, it's quite a bit of a masquerade, because a lot of these companies, if they were true patriots, they wouldn't, in my opinion, they'd be paying their fair share. They wouldn't be paying negative tax rate. It's quite absurd. But beyond that, I think we're at a particularly dangerous point right now because of the sequestration fight. Because what you're hearing on the news, and you hear from Fix the Debt and these others, is they're opposing sequestration, which protects, which right now the way it's structured would be devastating. But what it does is protect some of the entitlement programs, so-called entitlement programs like Social Security, which are called entitlement programs because you pay in with your on your paycheck, every single paycheck, a portion for Social Security interest. You're entitled to it.
You're entitled to get back what you pay for.
Right, which is why it's been carved out of the sequestration.
Right.
What you hear Fix the Debt and these CEOs and some of these former politicians who've done the revolving door, left Congress and gone to work for these big lobbying firms, or cashed out like Erskine Bowles, and managed to get lucrative multi-$100,000 board positions.
Right.
What you hear from these guys is sequestration is bad because it's not a balanced approach.
Right.
When they say the word balanced, you should be thinking about Fox News and Fair and Balanced. When they say balanced, what they're trying to say is they want to limit the impact, for example, on the Pentagon and defense contractors like Honeywell, which is part of Fix the Debt, and they want to get their hands on your Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid.
That's exactly right. And we're having Dean Baker on in our next segment, but you actually, and he speaks to these issues as eloquently as you do, but you wrote in one of your most recent articles that that Peterson's agenda may have actually failed because, the national elections was a referendum on some of his ideas and the rejection of certainly the ideas that were represented by the Republican ticket. But in the last two lines of your article, you say, at this point, many are wondering why Peterson is not being laughed out of the room, and then you end by saying perhaps he owns it. And so my last question for you, and quickly, is has the room been bought, and do the American people have a chance?
Well, I think we do have a chance, but our voices have to be heard because, quite frankly, these Fix the Debt guys, the Erskine Bowles operation and others, they're having meetings with members of Congress. They're having meetings with the White House. They're peddling this disinformation, and people in Congress need to hear from you. They need to hear from your neighbors that you do not want them to touch Social Security. You don't want these gimmicks like chain CPI, which are about paying less and less in your Social Security benefits the older you get as the cost of living goes up. These are ridiculous proposals, and quite frankly, Social Security, by any actuarial measure, is fully solvent for the next 20 years. And then there are ways to fix any potential later shortfall by closing off the loophole for people who make more than $110,000 a year. Right now, most Americans have no idea there's a gigantic loophole for people who make more than $110,000 who don't pay any more in Social Security beyond $110,000 because most Americans don't make $110,000
They don't make that much.
a year.
Right. Lisa Graves, the Executive Director of the Center for Media and Democracy, publisher of PRWatch.org, and the latest website, PetersonPyramid.org. Check it out. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
And you are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockymore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Stay with us after the break. We're welcoming Dean Baker.